was he had given a presentation up at Brown. I'd gone up there as an alumnus, one of these summer projects, and then we invited him down. Here, it turns out, not only had Frank Rush taught him as an undergraduate at Notre Dame, but then when Tom went out to California for his degree, he was in the same class with Frank Flanagan, this student of ours at Berkeley. And so he and Frank were great friends out there in California. He said that one of the things that Frank Flanagan was into was he was selling Oriental carpets on top of all the rest of the things he was doing out there. And he said he remembered driving up the Pacific Coast Highway with Frank in a Volkswagen Beetle with a couple of Oriental carpets tied on the roof. Now that's the two of them. But this is a memorable student. Certainly, he is the most memorable. I think anybody else would have to pale in comparison. But there are any number of good ones that we've got. Students who have gone on to teach at other universities that are CEOs of companies now, any number of people in Bell Labs that have been in the computer business right from the start. So all sorts of good connections with the college, and we've taken advantage of it. Because I can see a lot of this, because one of the things I'm supposed to be doing is keeping the alumni records. We've got a newsletter we mail out each year. And so I've got a whole list of all our alumni and all sorts of data on them. Sometimes it's better than what the alumni has.
Very good, very good. Okay, well, we might as well get to it. The faculty, the college committee first. Can you tell me about your years with the college committee and...
the faculty senate, you mean, or the college council?
Thank you, college council. We'll get to the faculty senate in a minute.
College council was one of these crazy things. They've got a set of minutes which are the worst things imaginable. I mean, when you can record that a motion was passed unanimously with 2 abstentions or 2 negative votes. I don't know what you mean by unanimously, but that's what's in the minutes. They would often say, well, we passed this document and the document isn't quoted anywhere. So, and that's the way it was run. It was one of these things that it was haphazard. Nobody really knew what it was supposed to be doing, but it met all day Saturdays 3 or 4 times a year. And but nobody was really sure what function it had, and I don't think Father Yanatelli had any idea either what it was supposed to be doing. So it was a big waste of time when you come right down to it.
Okay, the faculty senate. Tell me about your involvement with it and some of the highlights.
Well, of course, I've been here longer than the faculty senate has, so I've seen it right from the beginning. It has been a very good voice of faculty opinion. It, I think, has done a lot of very good things for the faculty and for the college in terms of curriculum development, in terms of faculty welfare, just general administration of the college. I think it's been up and down, but I think in the long run, a very good force for the college.
You do great minutes, I have to say. Excellent minutes. Okay, we talked about diversity when you were a student. Can you tell me about diversity as a teacher? African Americans, Hispanics, women? The great melting pot.
It came about, I think, very slowly. You had, I suppose, the first group that you would consider that would be labeled diversity today is when you had a large influx of Cuban refugees in the early 60s. They were fleeing Castro. And what you had there was students who were coming from professional families And so you had a very strong educational background. And so this group wasn't noticeably different, in a sense, from the the group that had been at St. Peter's before. You had a strong appreciation of education, and so it wasn't in any sense an us and them situation that you would tend to think of when you go around labeling people as minorities. It was only, I suppose, into the 70s when you started getting a very different demographic distribution in our source population. When the number of local students available in the high schools locally, because we weren't thinking in terms of boarding students in those days. And so you were still drawing primarily from Hudson County, the metropolitan area. You were suffering from the problem that New York State scholarships were not exportable while New Jersey ones are, which had a very serious impact because we were drawing heavily from New York high schools at that time. We drew a large contingent from Brooklyn Prep while it was still in existence, because it was easier to get to St. Peter's from Brooklyn than it was to get to Fordham. So we lost a large population source there. Very honestly, the college went co-ed. One of the main reasons was because you had this whole group of good students that we weren't drawing from. And so initially, and they admitted it, the admission standards for women were higher than they were for men. And this very slowly tapered off. They were afraid, I think, because they didn't know what was going to happen when the college went co-ed, because you had all of these horror stories that were accumulating from other places that had gone co-ed, that once you allow the number of women students to go beyond 40%, you'll suddenly find it's around 70%. And they didn't want that. I think the real problem was that when the college went co-ed, they really didn't know what they were getting into. That one of the crazy things at the time, you go and read some of the documents at the time, was trying to get a comparable set of rules for the dress code. The male students still had to wear jackets and ties. And of course, here you've got these poor Jesuits trying to write the female equivalent of that. And they didn't even know names for things, much less what to say. So that it caused trouble. I recall when we had the first women faculty members in mathematics. We had a Jesuit, it was Bob Canavan, as the chair at the department. And at that time, we had 2 apartments over in 121 Glenwood, where we still are. And he went so far as to take the 2 apartments, each one, of course, they were converted apartments, they each have a bathroom, and he labeled one for men and one for women. This is, I think, part of the problem in those days, that both the faculty, particularly the Jesuit faculty, were so inexperienced with women that you didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to get into this. And so it was very timorous at the time. But it worked out very well. And certainly, despite the complaints of that great, what did they call it? The Committee of 1,000 against going co-ed that actually consisted of 7 students. It worked out very well, and I think it was greatly beneficial for the college. And it was just about the right time to do it. But by the time you got into the late 70s, the college simply wasn't able to maintain the old entrance standards, and at the same time maintain the population size that they needed to balance the books. And so very slowly you started lowering admission standards. That was all they could do. And so it was at this, you accommodated this by going into developmental courses. I think mathematics did it without any, no, it wasn't a college-wide program at the time. It was simply something we did within the department. And even as early as late as the mid-'80s, we were hiring a faculty member who had been teaching at Fordham. And when the question was coming up as to, well, what does Fordham do about developmental students or students who aren't prepared? And the answer was nothing. You simply went into the standard core and you either survived or you didn't. That they didn't have a developmental program. But lots of other places, I recall from the alumni bulletin at Brown, that they were instituting a developmental program, and they defined developmental students as anyone whose College Board scores added up to, I think, less than 1,200. Now, at a time, we were lucky to get anybody whose College Board scores came to 1,200. But below that was their definition of developmental. So, but St. Peter's has done a great deal, has moved a great deal in that direction. And I think they had a number of very good programs. And if they maintain a personal contact with them, then they can accomplish a lot with those programs. The standard developmental program, well, you look in comparison to something like the EOF program, where all through 4 years you maintain a strong contact with these students, and you've got a very good success rate there. And this is something that more needs to be done for these students. But certainly the math department and the college in general has done a lot of good work, and I think a lot earlier and a lot better than many other colleges have done. So I think either moving in the upward direction or, unfortunately, moving in the downward direction in terms of a curriculum and meeting the needs of students, St. Peter's has always been sort of ahead of things.
1,200, holy cow. Can you tell me about a typical day in life of you as a professor and your usual classwork for a semester? How does your schedule work out usually?
Well, I'm thankfully at the point where I'm just teaching 4 courses. I don't need overload anymore. And I'm at the stage where I just couldn't handle overload. That's all right for young people or people who have the motivation that you really need the money. But I've gotten to the point where I don't have either motivation of that sort. So I'm teaching 4 courses and a variety of them. Unlike many other people, I like doing 4 different courses. I'm putting in that pitch because the president wants to move in a different direction. But I like it. I think mathematics is a different situation than it might be in some other fields. Perhaps in some of the humanities, you can easily handle several sections of the same course because you don't have to do exactly the same thing in each of the sections of a course, whereas in mathematics you have to. And you have to keep these sections together. And that gets kind of hectic when you've got a schedule that one of them meets on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and the other meets Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and sometimes one meets before the other and sometimes after the other. And then along comes this holiday that one of them has and the other one doesn't, and so they're out of sync. And it's not something you can say, well, we'll catch up to that in November. So I like teaching 4 different courses. And they're usually on different levels. So I would have, in mathematics, we always like to have at least one course where you're teaching something on the junior and senior level, one of the specialized courses just to keep your sanity. And then you have a cross-section of core courses, perhaps developmental courses, depending on the individual.
Good. Can you tell me, have you been a moderator or faculty advisor for any student organizations?
The only one I was ever involved with on that basis was the math club that we had back in the 60s that evolved into the Math Honor Society that we have on campus now. So I was the moderator of that math club. It had started off, actually it was the students that started it. It was simply a problem session for my course, my junior, senior level course. So the students were getting together, trying to do the problems, and this evolved into a math club. And so it got officially organized. And then eventually we put in for a charter for the National Society when Dr. Poyani arrived, because she had been involved with the society when she was at Douglas. And so she was involved with putting in the petition for the charter. It's a very strong honorary society, because the admission requirements and the forms and so on are almost the same as the data that you need to put in for Phi Beta Kappa. And the requirements of the faculty in terms of how many have doctorates and so on are very comparable.
Very good. How are we doing on Dave, bro?
You've got 10 minutes left.
Okay. Can we get a change over? Well, we're pretty much near the end, but we might run over. Okay. I'll ask one more and then we can do it. Thanks, Robert. Okay. Publications. Have you been published, and what are some of the titles of your works?
Actually, not very much. I had published one article that was the basis of a talk that I'd given actually when the Pi Mu Epsilon Society was set up here. I'd given the initial lecture, and that evolved into a publication. It was something that came out of the math course that I was teaching at the time. And then my doctoral thesis, which was actually in the history of mathematics. And I'd published that. And in fact, at that time, since we had a great number of electives, we actually had a course here in the history of mathematics that wasn't just all talking about the Greeks, but actually was a history of 19th, 20th century mathematics. And so that went over very well until the supply of students ran out. But I've been more involved in committee work and that sort of thing. So that there's any number of things that developed out of courses that probably were publishable, but you just don't get around to these things, because at the time we were teaching so many extra courses and doing things that you just don't get to things like that. And unfortunately, when you didn't have to, you just didn't do it.
Wow. I knew you had a bit of history in you. That's a good thing.
For some strange reason, I enjoy history.
Good.
So I've been working on history of other things as well as history of mathematics. And
Excellent.
I've developed an interest in researching some work in history of Ireland and history of a couple of other things as well.
Good. Ireland, yes. Did a paper on Dave Valera and the Fianna Fáil, but I'm a history major, so I'm fed up with it right now. I'll like it when I graduate. That's probably it. But how you doing so far?
Fine.
Everything's going good? If you'll excuse me for a moment.
Yeah.
We'll have about 10 more questions if
Okay.
you can hang in there. We'll see what's up with the tape. We want to run out on you here. We want to preserve this. Blackmail material. No, I'm just kidding. How we doing? Oh, no, we're not done. Yeah, Dr. Kiernan, we're rolling. Okay. When do you guys start up again?
I think you're sitting on it.
No. Make nice sounds. Thank you. So when do you start up classes? August 25th, is it?
3 weeks from yesterday. I'm not ready for it.
I hear you. I mean, summer's going by too quickly, you know? Always the case. Okay, picking up again. What are some of the rules and regulations you've had to abide by as a teacher at the school?
Well, of course, it said when I started, both the faculty and the students had to wear ties and jackets, and an academic outfit. Usually, the black bachelor's gown is what everybody would wear, but that was the requirement. You started class with a prayer. These would be the standard in-class activities of that sort. But it was a lot more, I don't know whether you would call it parochial or whatever the word would be for it, but not, in a sense, officially a kind of intellectual endeavor so much as following the rules. So it was up to individual faculty members to sort of improvise on this, or individual departments to develop a policy. But we survived. I think it was in tune with the times, but at the same time it lasted a little bit too long.
When did changeover occur?
Well, I think largely with Leo McLaughlin. He came in as academic dean and pretty much turned the place on end. I think there were, by that time, enough individual faculty members who would support him and that he could build on. So it worked out well. I mean, there was certainly problems in the transition, but it was a case of, well, there was some dead wood that needed to be cleaned out. There were, at the time also, you had a number of new departments, and perhaps people weren't too careful about who was being hired at the time, and so you had some unfortunate choices too. So it took a while, as with any new project, to iron out the problems.
Okay, shifting gears from problems to colleagues. Can you tell me about some of your memorable colleagues through the years, and give me some of your impressions of them, if you could.
Well, certainly Bill Cruz, who had been my teacher as an undergraduate, and then was chair of the department when I came to teach. He became ill early in the 60s, and unfortunately lingered on for another 15 years. Certainly an inspiration as being a good teacher and concerned with students and their needs, and just gearing courses towards your audience. Frank Riccio, who really was instrumental in starting up a computer program at all here on campus, one that was eventually passed on to Alec Calanis. But it was Frank, together with, I guess, Bill Hubner in management, who really brought the first computer onto campus and ran the first courses. In fact, we're running courses even without a computer, sort of teaching, well, this is what would happen if you had the machine. So any number of good people along the line. After all, any number of them are still here, so you don't want to have to be careful of what you say. So I'm deliberately not referring to people, many of whom are very good friends and colleagues and worth praising as these. One very good choice that we made who wasn't able, who didn't stay, was Mike Fahey. We got him from Fordham because they weren't keeping him. And he came here almost by accident. I like to say that Eileen Poyani picked him up on the plane. She and the two of them had been out to one of the conventions on the West Coast. And they were coming back, and she thought he was a book salesman. And so she starts up this conversation, hoping to get a couple of free copies. And it turns out that he was looking for a job because Fordham had terminated him. And he had seen our ad, but didn't seem to think it fit us. And she said, well, why not apply? And so we brought him in for an interview. And it was one of these interviews that as soon as he wasn't out the door, we were ready to hand him the paper, the contract. He was that good in terms of an approach towards mathematics, an approach towards students, and just all around good personality. And so we had him for 7 years. Actually, he had tenure and left. Let's not get into why. It was a fight with another department. But he was really good. I mean, he was into really good research in computer graphics and understood the mathematics that was involved as well as the computers. And I believe is just finishing off or has published a book in the field. He went out to Chapman College in Los Angeles because he had gotten his degree from California, Santa Barbara, and was working with someone out there at Santa Barbara. So he's chair of the Department of Math and Computer Science out there with tenure. In fact, despite how fast or how hard tenure is to get these days, they told him to apply 2 years early for tenure, and told him even before he applied that he was going to get it, as well as telling somebody else in the department who was up for tenure in that year, don't even bother filling out the forms, you're not going to get it. So he's that good. And he was really a great loss to our department.
Yeah. Sorry, I never met him. Okay, can you tell me what your teaching philosophy is? How do you go about teaching?
Well, for one thing, it's the nature of the discipline that, as Charlie Brown once lamented in a cartoon, that the problem with mathematics is there's no room for difference of opinion. And you simply have to learn it. And you have to appreciate the value of following a definition literally and taking it exactly what it means. And there's a great carryover of this approach into many other fields because you learn to read texts carefully, you learn to read insurance contracts carefully and all of this. And this is what you hear back from the students later on. You know, I hated the course when you were teaching it, but you really appreciate it later on with not so much the mathematics itself as the discipline that's involved in it. And you simply have to try to get this across to students. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And unfortunately, students these days are far too willing to just run away from it rather than stick it out and appreciate that there is a long-range benefit to this. But I try to bring out the fact that not so much you're here to learn the logic of it, because that's the worst way to do things, but to try to see the connection that the mathematician is really looking at the real world just as much as the poet or the philosopher or the historian or the economist or the physicist is. They're just looking at it from different perspectives, looking for different points of view of that one reality. And it's this thing that I try to get across. And sometimes you do. And that's what makes it worthwhile.
How would you connect Jesuit education with mathematics, and how have you used that in the classroom?
Well, I think this very same point of view, that this universality of knowledge is something that's coming out of the Jesuit tradition, and something that has really come to you. It isn't something that somebody can so much tell you and convince you of. You become aware of it, and I think that's what makes it all the stronger. And so I think it's this that flavors the mathematics. And it is good to get across to the students, too, that there have been any number of very famous Jesuit scientists, that the Jesuits aren't just in philosophy and theology, that it is a very universal group. And down through the centuries, there have been lots of famous names connected with mathematics and the natural sciences. And you try to get this across.
Well, you mentioned about your own commencement and how the rain made it memorable. Can you tell me about commencements as a teacher and any that stand out in your mind? They
tend to blur together. I mean, you get, every so often, there are ones which, for one reason or another, stick out in your mind. Sometimes you can't even remember why you remember it so much as you do remember it. William Buckley and his rambling talk. And some of them that go on for ages and ages. It wasn't at a commencement, but I recall one time we had Cardinal Cushing here. Now, for the $10,000 he gave us for renovating Cushing Hall, you sat through a 2-hour speech. It was right after dinner. And I forget where it was, but that whole dinner, it was a formal dinner. He just got up, didn't even, the people who knew ahead of time at least had a chance to run out to the bathroom first. But otherwise you were stuck there for 2 hours. And of course he can talk with this nasal Boston accent and say absolutely nothing for 2 hours. And just drone on and on. You were sound asleep by the time it was over. But it's speakers like this that become, in one way, memorable. Others were very good. But we've had good speakers here. We've had very famous speakers here. We had Martin Luther King. I gave him an honorary degree, even before it was the politic thing to do. So that early in the 60s, certainly under Father Yanatelli, even earlier than that, I think we started being involved in honoring people in the civil rights movement. Connections with people like Dorothy Day, with any number of others that you could mention. The move that Father Glynn made to patch things up with Will Durant, this, I think, gives you or fills out your idea of what it is to be a Jesuit and the Jesuit tradition. That I think, as much as breaking off with him originally, making up with him at the end was part of a continuing and evolving Jesuit tradition.
I'd love to get somebody who went to school with Will Durant, but unfortunately,
no, I don't think there's anybody left.
1907. But were you there when they gave the honorary degree to Martin Luther King? And any recollections of that?
I'm sure I was there. I don't recall it specifically. I think my own social outlook and politics hadn't quite moved in that direction at the time. And so I don't think I was as enthusiastic about it as I should have been. But after all, it was about the time I was voting for Barry Goldwater. But I think, as I had said earlier, a lot of the fact that my own opinion evolved at the time was the connection of Frank Keating with that movement, that it gave it that I tended to look at it as having something worthy of respect and honesty to it, that there was something there. And so certainly as a good Jesuit and a good model, again, one of the great people that we've had here at the college.
Although Goldwater, he was a nice guy too, from what I hear. You were here when Kennedy was assassination, both Jack and Robert. Can you tell me what the mood was on campus and for yourself, what you were doing on both occasions?
I think it was certainly a shock. I think that the general attitude on campus at the time was certainly favorable towards him. I think that the general mood would be sympathetic with his position, some of it simply because he was a Catholic president, and others supportive of his policies. Now that you mention him, I can recall something connected with Kennedy was the night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I was teaching that night. And I recall that what they had done was to give everyone the option of canceling the class and go down to the cafeteria to watch the speech on television. And so that certainly was memorable. And in connection with that, although it's not directly related to the college, my brother, who had graduated here and went through the ROTC, was in the active army at the time. He was out at Fort Sill at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And no matter what they say about planning or, it wasn't really going to happen, they were on a plane with atomic weapons at the time of the speech, waiting to see whether he was going to say yes or no.
Wow, that close, huh?
Yes.
That close. Wow. But getting back to commencement, I guess, have you ever sponsored anybody or have put a name forward for an honorary degree?
I've suggested one or two. They didn't take me up on it. I had who did I suggest? I had suggested Raul Julia. I don't recall if they eventually gave him a degree or not, but I had suggested him. And then a couple of years after that, the author Thomas Fleming, because of his connection with Jersey City politics. But I think maybe his connection with Jersey City politics is why he didn't get the degree, because it might have been just the wrong thing at the wrong time. But he had just written that book, which was actually a history of Haig's administration, or at least the end of it.
The legendary Haig, yes.
Yes.
Okay, we're down to the last few here. What's the best advice or guidance that you've given your students, do you feel, in general, specifically, from your days as a teacher here?
Well, in terms of certainly the math majors and good students all around, one thing I'd like to suggest to them is to do the New York Times crossword puzzle.
In ink?
Well, I do it in one of these erasable ink pens because you can't get pencils anymore. But I think the advantage of that and the kind of training it gets and the sort of thing that you tend to emphasize is the ability to look at things from several different points of view. That a text doesn't necessarily mean just one thing, and you have to read it carefully and reflect on all the possible things it could mean. And this is what you need to be creative in mathematics, to look at all the possible things that could follow from a set of premises and be able to juggle the ideas around until it fits into place, and how you come up with a proof. And it's that same mental exercise. And so I've always passed that idea along as one sort of almost unconnected with mathematics, so it seems sort of innocuous, but it is very helpful.
Okay, two more questions. I asked you before what an experience, St. Peter's experience was for you as a student, getting to the audience. How about as a teacher? How would you tell our studio audience or viewing audience what St. Peter's education means to you and what it would mean to them?
Well, as I said, I think there's a great advantage to a broad liberal arts curriculum. I think at the same time, I think we have lost something in that it is not as sequential as it once was, that it's too spread out and very little, almost nothing that has anything else as a prerequisite. And so you don't get this follow-up, you don't get the continuity, and you don't get the need to retain information from one course to another. And I think that's a disadvantage today. At the same time, just the fact of a broad liberal arts experience, I don't know whether it should be following every trend that comes along. I think it should be a lot more in a traditional approach to the topics and the material. But there is a great advantage in this diversity. A humanities background for people in business and the sciences, a science background for people in the humanities at the same time. That neither one of them should be in a position of avoiding the other. And I think it's just that breadth of experience is very important. And I think we have, in comparison to what I see at many other colleges, a very good curriculum now. I think we also have a very good rapport among the faculty. That this is a comment that we get from many people that we recruit who have taught at other colleges, who have found a much friendlier experience here in the faculty, a much greater feeling of collegiality, both in the department and among the faculty in general, than they had found at other places, including other Jesuit colleges. So I think that's our strong points, and I wouldn't want to see it weakened.
Very good. Okay, last question I have is, you mentioned your involvement with the Alumni Organization.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about some of your functions with them, and how do you support the alumni right now in other capacities?
Well, I suppose the main active connection I have is maintaining the data file for the department on alumni and sending out a newsletter each year. And I think we've maintained contact with our graduates that way much better than some other departments have. And through this, we've been able to supply speakers for career development, people who have maintained an active work with the Alumni Organization, perhaps because we have kept up contact with them. I also like to think we've got maybe a little bit better percentage of contributors, simply because they know that what's going on in the department and that there's still somebody there that knows who they are and who remembers them when they were students. So I think this is something I wish other departments would have. I think that the nursing department has it. The pre-med program did. I don't know if they still maintain it. But I don't know of any other department that has these kinds of records. And part of the problem is you really can't reconstruct these records after the fact. I mean, I have them simply because it was a job that Bill Cruz gave me the year I started here. And so, since the department had only begun officially in 1953, nearly everybody on the list is somebody whom I knew either as a student or as a teacher. And so you were able to reconstruct those few earlier years. And so our record of who was a math alumnus and alumna as well, too, these days. And in terms of keeping in contact with and keeping these accurate records, sometimes I'm correcting the alumni files. So,
very good.
But it's been fun.
One last point of interest. You've spoken of the alumni who are math graduates.
Yeah.
What kind of advice do you give those who are somewhat math deficient? How do you keep them going? Because often they're forgotten in the system.
You mean as students?
As students.
Well, as I said, the math department pretty much on its own had instituted a developmental program back in the mid-70s. We started off by experimenting with what is now the finite math course. We tried a couple of things. We did get arrangements where we could run small sections. We could take an entire year to do one semester course. And so we sort of experimented with what worked and what didn't work. And then we found, in terms of the deficiencies that students were coming into the college with, we found it was necessary to put one and then two courses in front of the core. I think it's one of the strengths of the college and our program that we have maintained decent math courses as a requirement, that every student is supposed to take either calculus, if they're in the natural science majors, or something that requires and needs calculus, and we've got two versions of that, or finite math, or a rather strong 6-credit course for math and the humanities. I think many places have simply given up on doing mathematics at all. And that is simply the wrong way to go, because students, no matter what area they are in, are going to have to function in mathematics when they get out into the world. They can't just take somebody else's word for it that this bill in the restaurant is right, that they're not getting cheated on their insurance rates, on their mortgage rates, on loans. They've got to at least know how these things work. And they've got to have, I think it's the idea of a liberal arts education, that the real origin of that term is that it's freeing you from being dependent on somebody else's opinion, to develop the ability to function independently in the world. And you've got to function mathematically in this world.
So you would suggest that they just not give up?
Yes, because you can't run away from this, because it is something that's going to be there when you get out in the world. And so you've simply got to face up to it. And simply that facing up to things that are hard and that you don't like is also part of the educational experience. That it's, you can't just run away from income tax. You can't run away from a mortgage. You can't run away from an accident. And what are we teaching students if we let them get away with, oh, that's too hard for you, so you don't have to do it? That's not the kind of education that St. Peter's ought to be giving students. And I hope we don't